It's October 15th, 2017. I'm Mike Cohen. I'm here with Connie Schwartzman, and we're here for another in a series of Steve Delia interviews with poets. Today's poet, Bill Van Buskirk.
Hi, Bill.
Hi, Steve.
Nice for you to do the interview. I'm glad to have you.
Delighted to do it, yeah.
So this is strange, but I always begin with this question. How did you get into poetry?
Well, I was an English major in college, but then for a long time didn't pay much attention to literature, except for maybe spy novels or something like that. But then in 1990, my wife contracted cancer and died at the age of 35, and that was really it just shocked me. It just totally upset my world, you know, and I found myself starting to write, kind of in response to that shock, and I read a poem at her memorial service, and both of her parents, who were divorced, came up to me separately and said, "I want to see everything that you write about our daughter." And so I said, "Okay." They were my first audience, you know, and so I sent them everything, you know, and then. After a while, I started writing about other things, you know, and then a year after her death, I had her friends over to dinner, and I had made up a packet of poems for each one of them, and that's kind of how I got started. So it was very much a response to that tragedy that got me spurred me in that direction.
It's interesting you say that because when we did an interview with Roger Lowenthal, I asked him that very question.
Mm-hmm.
I said, do you think poets start writing in response to some kind of negative thing in their life?
Mm-hmm.
And here we are, and you're sort of picking up that.
That's how it worked for me. Yeah.
Do you think it works like that for a lot of poets? Or some poets?
Well, probably, yeah. I don't know. Yeah, I guess a lot. I've met a number of people who said, "Oh, yeah, something like that happened to me." Or after they started writing, then something happened to them, and then that got sort of folded into their writing. But it's hard not to. I think you don't want to keep the tragic parts of life out of your poetry. I mean, that seems like a terrible waste.
Yeah, it's a shame to go through it and not have.
Yeah, right. You do all that suffering, you know what I mean, to show for it.
But the interesting thing is, your poetry may originate in tragedy. Yours is some of the most cheerful poetry that there is. You even have the Joie de Vivre book.
Yeah. And that's interesting. I discovered that as I started writing. You know that I really like to write funny stuff. I don't write enough of it for what I want, but what I do write, I really love, and I found that the content of things changed. You know, I write very little about Gail anymore these days.
When reading humorous poetry at a reading, have you ever got caught in a spot where you read something humorous that no one laughed?
Yeah. Or they laugh at the wrong times. You know, the parts that I don't think are funny. You know.
I think that has to be, I mean, it's happened to me certainly too, and
Mm-hmm.
I think that's probably one of the worst responses that can happen. The humor, I mean, it's kind of risky.
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't think of humor as being risky, but, you know, it's one thing if no one applauds, they still may like it, and they're just simply not applauding. But when they don't laugh, it's something funny.
Then the silence is resounding.
Yes, it's a whole other animal.
You know, now silence after a sad poem can be great. You know, especially if it's absolute, if nobody's stirring. You know, then to me that's this
That is a response.
You know, that's a response. But you don't want that after a funny poem.
What was some of your early influences?
Mark Doty. He was a gay man living in Provincetown during the AIDS epidemic, and so he was surrounded for about 10 years of his life where everybody he knew was dying just about, and he was immune to the AIDS virus for some reason, and so I went to the Dodge Poetry Festival for the first time in, I think it was 1996. And I arrived late, I got there just in time for lunch. And I ended up sitting at this table with these 3 or 4 young women. And they were talking about this guy who was going to be reading this afternoon. And they said, Mark Doty, you know, and I said, well, who's he? And he actually was their teacher. They were students at Sarah Lawrence. And so they told me this sort of the story about him. And I thought, gee, this guy seems to have gone through a lot of what I went through, you know. And so that has absolutely been the truth. I've read most, if not all, of his books of poetry and several of his memoirs, and I find that in his voice, I find a voice that's complementary to my own. It almost feels like me talking when I read his poems, or that sad elegiac kind of part of me. I feel like, and so I think he really. Hearing him read and say, "Oh, this kind of poetry can really work," you know. And Doty has really won several book awards, you know, and he's very well renowned. This can really, you know, it gave me encouraged to sort of think, okay, this is really what the kind of poet I want to be. So I think he had a big influence. I've only met him once. I've only had like a 5-minute conversation with him. That's the extent of it. But he's had a tremendous influence.
Who else would you say? Maybe not even in terms of influence, but just poets that you like, poets you enjoy reading.
Wallace Stevens, I find myself stealing his lines all the time. Usually,
edit that part.
Often unconsciously. I mean, I'll find that I wrote a poem called "Man Made Out of Words," you know, and I'm reading through, you know, Wallace Stevens, thumbing through his book of poems, and there's men made out of words, you know. And,
really?
And I'd read that poem before, but I totally didn't remember. So it's a real funny kind of influence. Often I don't understand his poems. When I read them, I say, what's this all about, you know? But yet there's always a line or two in there that really stirs up something, you know. It's like I kind of often have the experience of getting stirred up without knowing why. And I think that's really good poetry, I think, when that happens. And so I really admire him a lot. Mary Oliver, a wonderful nature poet who also has a real feel for the sadness and the transience of life. I like Billy Collins. Lisa Mueller I like a lot. She won the prize that Poetry Magazine gives out once a year for a lifetime achievement, and she won it two years ago. And I thought, and then I got a copy of the book, and I could see why. It was just fabulous work.